Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Timestamps and a full list of materials are in the video description. Today we are going to create some more holiday cards. Let's start out by cutting watercolor paper into smaller pieces. I always write the brand of paper I'm using on the back side of the paper to make sure I know it's actually the back, because it feels different to paint on and it behaves quite different when you paint on it. The first step is to prepare the card. I'm using postcards since I have a few of them, but you can also buy blank cards at any store, or you can just buy a piece of paper and fold it in half. I wetten the whole page and then I go in with a larger brush and some pigment. I go back and forth, leaving lines on the page and making sure that it has some type of structure. It dries really fast, so it dries while you go over it with a brush, and this is why I get those pretty lines. When the paper is bulging upwards in the middle, don't worry, you can push it down with your finger because the center will be covered up by the painting that we will create later on. If you don't push it down, you might get some puddles on the edges that you have to deal with later, so I'm just making my life easier. Once it's dry, I turn it around and do the other side of my card. Don't worry if there are some splatters on the back side. It will just add to the whole look of the background. Also, the really dark spots will probably become loose now and just disperse with the other paint. So you will probably not even have any of the large dark spots on the back side once you're done doing this. A lid has the perfect shape and size to paint the Christmas ornaments on. I'm also sketching in the strings that the ornaments hang on to make sure that they will be centered. Some out of focus branches will look amazing on this card. I wetten my watercolor paper and I use my brush with quite a bit of the green pigment on it. It's a smaller brush, so I can drag out the pigment and help it move. The pigment dries pretty fast and I can add some more layers on it, or even just some more pigments in the center of it to give it some structure and make it look more interesting. Putting down the water first will give you the ability to create out of focus branches. I will also add some out of focus blobs on the other side of this branch just to make the painting more interesting. In order to make some blobs, I just put on some water, let it sink in for a second, and then I touch the paper with my paint-filled brush and just let them disperse naturally. I can help them move a bit or even add some more pigment. Once the card is dry, I go back in with my wet brush and move around some of the pigments that got stuck on the edge earlier to even it out a bit. This is a messy background with a lot of structure, therefore it doesn't need to be perfect and you do not need to do this step, but I just feel it will look better with another layer of paint. In order to paint in the Christmas elements, I first put on some water. I do not let the water go all the way to the edge, because it gives me the ability to get a clean edge later on when I go in with the pigment. I disperse the pigment on the drying ornament and help it to move around a bit. Key here is that I turn the card as much as possible in order to get the best chance of painting a straight edge. There will be an uneven coverage with the pigment in order to evoke more interest in the painting. The bottom of my Christmas ornament has more pigments to kind of show that it's darker and in the shadows. I then soak up some of the pigment with my damp brush in order to create a highlight. The next Christmas ornament will be painted in with the same method. I'm leaving a tiny little gap between the two ornaments to make sure that I do not get any unintentional bleeds. As an alternative, I could simply wait until the first Christmas ornament is fully dry, but I really don't want to have that waiting time. I could create some highlights as well by just adding water to the areas where I want the highlight to be, but that wouldn't give me full control over where the highlights are. And also the paint I'm using is staining the paper, so there would be more paint left behind. A metallic gel pen or a glitter gel pen is a really great option to paint in some of the details on this Christmas ornaments. I always paint in those highlights first that do have a stationary position on my painting. So the hanger and the string will always be in the same position on any Christmas ornaments. Depending on how abstract you want your card to be, you can give it more or less detail. You can have it rounded and have a 3D perspective by having some back of the hanger visible, but it's really a matter of taste. I then proceed to paint in some of the other details on those Christmas ornaments. And keep in mind, those Christmas ornaments are round, so your lines always need to be round. This is a loose painting, so I'm not going for perfection here. I'm just quickly painting in some of the lines and they are a little crooked. Then I'm adding some details, but all of this is not perfect to give it a certain look. I'm almost done. Now I'm adding some double-sided tape to the back of my little painting and just tape it on the card that I prepared earlier. And I did change my mind about splatters. I add some snowflakes using my gel pencil. Well, then I look at it and regret taping it on the card. I really want some purple splatters on this, and to be honest, I don't really care if I get any on my busy background at this point. I fill my brush with pigment and dab it on another brush to create some splatters on my painting. Since the background is so busy, it doesn't really matter that some splatters get on the background as well, and I just use some paper towel to wipe them off. Let's move on to the snowman. I'm using a lid to help me sketch out the center part of the snowman, but for the head and the legs it's just easier to hand draw them because they are not round. I put on some water in the areas that I want to paint first and then I go in with the pigment. I need to work section by section here because it dries pretty fast. The secret to make the snowman pop is to give it a larger contrast. So the pigment needs to be really thick right next to the snowman, and then I can just let it bleed out towards the edges. And of course, I do help the pigment move. Using this method, I'm working my way around the snowman. I paint section by section. I always paint in the area that touches the previously painted one first to make sure that I get soft edges there. Key here is to turn the snowman upside down to give you greater access to the area that you want to paint on. It's also less likely that you are accidentally going to touch the area that you just painted in. If there are any puddles forming, they will give a distracting bloom there, so I try not to have any puddles form there. If puddles are occurring somewhere, I mop them up with my brush or soak them up with a piece of paper towel. If I accidentally touch the drying pigment, it will cause blooms, and I really try to avoid that. The silhouette of the snowman is not perfect yet because there will be a second layer of paint once this one is dry. Now I'm working on the background. I put on some water and then add the pigment later to let the pigment disperse. For this background, I do not want my pigment to go all the way to the edge to have a greater contrast on it. I do apologize that part of my painting is out of the frame. I didn't notice it until I started editing. The gap that I'm leaving towards the edge of the paper is not straight, because I want this to be a messy background. I just go in with some pigment and I move the pigment around while it's drying to have a really uneven layer of paint on there. I really like using non-watercolor paper for this because it makes it so easy to get an uneven and busy background, which is a really cool look for Christmas cards, I believe. When you add water to the paper, the fibers expand, which makes them swell. This is why the center of my painting swallows upwards and bends. The center of my card will be covered up by the snowman, so I can just go in and push it down with my finger because it leaves marks, but it will not be visible in the end. I'm literally watching my paint dry here, and I put in some drops of water to create some snowflakes. I can also mop up certain areas with a paper towel to make it more busy, but those snowflakes, they are created by putting water on and the water pushes the pigment aside. Back to the snowman. I'm now mixing in a little bit of black into the blue I used earlier to give it a darker color. I wanted to have some type of grey sheen. This is why I'm using black and not another color to darken the blue. I repeat the same procedure as before, but the water I'm putting down first doesn't reach all the way to the edge of the blue I painted in first. I am creating a second layer of paint on this to make it look darker and even more vibrant. If I'm messing around too much with the paint, I can lift the previous layers of pigment, which is really not desirable here, so I try not to do this, but I'm bad for it. I put on some water, I go in with my paint, which is darker than the previous one, and just let it disperse, in theory. I need to have really clean edges to the snowman now. So if I have a little accident somewhere or go out of line, I just change the whole shape of the snowman. This pigment does stain the page and can definitely not be removed. Well, and that's how you create a gradient on your snowman to make it pop even more. This paint does dry pretty fast, but I still need to be careful not to touch it when I continue painting in a minute. For the shadow, I'm using a really light wash of the blue with some of the black that I added earlier. I'm not using the same color that I used earlier for painting around the snowman, because I really wanted to stand out. Shadows in the right places really make the snowman come to life. There is a shadow on the ground, and there's also a shadow on the left side of the snowman and under each of the balls of the elements of the snowman. While the shadows dry, I add a light second coat of paint to them to give them some diversity. Next, I'm using a light wash of the black in order to paint in the eye and the buttons. The eyes can make or break your painting here. I made sure to paint them in with a pencil earlier so that they are just in the right spot. The segments of the snowman now deserve some outlines. I'm using the darkest blue that I used back for the shadows. Since it had a minute to dry on my palette, it is now more intense and less diluted with water. Time for the carrot. I first painted in yellow and then I intensify the colors towards the thicker part of the carrot. I drop in the orangish red and just let it bleed towards the front. This color variation makes it look even more interesting. For the snowflakes, I'm using some acrylic paint. I water it down a bit, soak it up in my brush and splash it on the painting. It's opaque, therefore it will not be see-through and it will still be visible when I'm done painting. I water it down more and more as I go in order to have a color variation in my snowflakes. Once I'm done that, I give it 2 minutes to dry while I prepare my brush with some of the blue paint from earlier to also create some snowflakes in that blue. Some of the snowflakes got in really weird spots on top of the snowman and I just saved the painting by using a paper towel to wipe them off. Once everything's dry, I'm adding some double-sided tape to the back of the snowman and I can tape it on my card. And I'm done with my painting. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and I will see you with another video.